This is our fourth in 5 curatorial conversations with the recipients of the Emily Hall Tremaine Journalism Fellowship for Curators. And today, we're very fortunate to have Dan Cameron, renowned curator, and we're going to be talking about his current curatorial project, as many of you probably saw with the various posts that were done, as well as the email exhibition that was sent to everybody this past Sunday. So I'm sure Dan probably doesn't need introductions from many of you, but for those of you who do need an introduction, he is a New York-based curator, art writer, and educator whose public career began in 1982 with his new museum exhibition, Extended Sensibilities, the first museum effort in the US to examine gay and lesbian identity in art. In the intervening 40 years, Cameron has held senior curatorial positions at the New Museum, the Orange County Museum of Art, and CAC, Contemporary Arts Center in New Orleans. And in 2008, he was the founder of Prospect New Orleans, the contemporary art triennial to benefit the city after Hurricane Katrina. He's organized numerous biennials and exhibitions around the world and has published extensively. His current book on Nicole Eisenman's paintings was published in 2021 by Lind Humphreys. So without further ado, Dan, welcome. I also want to say I'm speaking from Brooklyn, which is the unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape, the Shinnecock, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. So welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to be able to take on this project with, with Hyperlergic.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about those who read your exhibition and had read the posts. We'll have a little sense of how you got there. But for those who may not know, I wonder if you can sort of tell us a little bit about this journey to this island off the coast of Chile that has become a place that you've returned to again and again and been talking to the artists there.
Well, a lot has to do with, Chile is a country that I've been to a lot. I feel somehow connected to it. I think that just happens to us with certain places on Earth. And on my very first trip there in 1991, the artist Eugenio Ditborn, who many people know as the inventor of the airmail paintings format, he was a studio visit and he had me read out my itinerary and he said, wait, you're not going to Chiloé. And I had seen, read descriptions of Chiloé and I said, no, is it essential? And he said, well, no, essential, no, but they have the southernmost museum of art in the world and you should do a show there. Those were more or less his words. And being the age I was at the time, this being my first trip on my own to investigate a South American country, especially one on the furthest end of the continent, those words stuck with me. I mean, Chiloé was just in my head and it took me a really long time to get there. I guess that's the sort of odd part about this. I kept being involved in Chile. And even though Ditborn's idea was still stuck in my head, it took me until 2015 to actually get there. Right. And then once I got there, I couldn't stop going. I just said, wow, this is an incredible place. And the artists I'm meeting are really quite extraordinary. And I guess the idea of doing a show there was the impetus. It was always like, oh, I'm going to do an exhibition on Chiloé. And so I'm going back in order to get to know the place more, figure out how to do it, figure out where to do it, figure out who the local artists are going to be. I mean, it was a whole sort of recipe. And, the trip that, this grant underwrote was my 5th trip in 8 years. And the last time I was there in late 2019, Chile was undergoing this incredible almost a revolution in a way, but a very nonviolent one. And I wound up in Chile again, and I started thinking, wait a minute, there's this kind of curatorial vanity, at work here, where you think, you want to do something, you want to give up yourself to this situation, And at the same time, all you're doing is replicating a formula that we all know. It's very familiar to us from international biennials, and maybe it's not the best approach always. Maybe there's another way to think about it. So on that trip, I just started thinking maybe what the project I'm working on, which is called Alrededores, surroundings, maybe that is about just setting up art projects in various parts of the islands, the three major islands, and letting them happen over a long period of time, letting them gestate. So that's where we left off with the pandemic. And then during the pandemic, people from Chiloé were reaching out to me because they were seeing what New York was going through on TV. And I just suddenly, I don't know, I had one of those brainstorms, as I think we all did at various points during the shutdown, where I thought, I've really been approaching this wrong. This isn't about a show that I do. This is about them and how can I say it, the privilege that's already attached to my function as a first row curator to bring attention to them. Like, we don't have to rebuild, or we don't have to create a new vehicle, just bring attention to them in the most direct way possible. And that's how this latest trip came about.
Yeah, I wonder if you could give a context for people, because you've been curating for a few decades. Like, I think in the 90s, that model that you mentioned seemed kind of exciting and new in a way. Would you characterize it that way, or did it never feel that way to you?
No, it was exciting and new. I mean, I identify as the Oakley generation, where, the phenomenon, I mean, global art had happened a little bit earlier, and it's debatable whether it was the Havana Biennial or Musicien de la Terre. But as it was really Oakley more than anyone else who sort of set the terms for a post-colonial framework of the International Biennial. And that was incredibly exciting and new at the time. It didn't necessarily imply that you had to dismantle the mechanism of curatorial practice, from the inside, which is, I think, more what we're being called upon to do at the moment, which is just look at our practice and just go, okay, let me just deconstruct it and put it back together again and see how this new cobbled together version works.
Yeah, and I think also with social media and the way images are shared, there isn't the same, I guess, the same need to sort of bring things to you in a way. I wonder, what do you think has changed? Like, what are some of the material realities that have changed this kind of way of curating?
Well, I think what's happened for me, especially through social media, is that I began to understand that what a curator does is, let's just say it's two-part. You find art that you respond to, that you have a deep relationship with, and then you find a way to share that with others in whatever form you can. So there doesn't need to be a whole lot in between those 2 points, as long as you have made this connection yourself as a viewer. And then as a curator, you want to say, hey, everybody, come look at this, like the Lourdes effect. That's what where it's just like, oh my God, call all the village together and come see this, this contemporary artwork. And that's kind of what I did in this. I mean, it was a road trip. It was me going back to Chiloé for the 5th time, where everybody knows me by now. I mean, I'm sort of walking into places and kind of like, oh, hey. I mean, the craziest thing, this is the craziest. So there's a port town that I love very much. It's called Dalcaue. And Dalcaue has the best artisan market. It also has the freshest ceviche. And it has just a really nice vibe to it. It's not particularly artsy, but and there's a kind of high-end artisan boutique in town run by a couple of folks who happen to be friends of mine. They've become friends over the years. And as I walked into their space on like day 5 and just sort of said, hey, everyone, it's me, I'm back. The first thing that Andrea had to tell me was that, she was happy to see me because her son had just been accepted into Sorbonne in Paris, and he was majoring in curatorial studies.
Oh, wow.
And I just thought, Of course, of course he is, and part of what we have to do now is create spaces in a way that make it possible for, him to not say, I think I'd rather stay in Paris, but maybe think of a way where, as being an active curator, he can come back, to Chiloé and do more. I mean, the odd part about this is the central government would love nothing more than to put sort of investing in that area, like really make investments into culture, but the structure doesn't quite work that way. I'm sort of doing my own part as an independent agent in the field.
Oh, it's great. So I just want to tell people, if you have questions while we're talking, feel free to open it up in the chat. Why don't we take a little tour? You have a little photo tour prepared for us. So if that's all right with you, Dan, I'm going to cue this up, and then we can go through these photos, and you can talk a little bit over them, and we can just have a conversation. Great.
That would be great. So to get to Chiloé, the way I get to Chiloé is I fly from Santiago to a city called Puerto Montt. And in Puerto Montt, you rent a vehicle at the airport, and then you drive to the ferry. The ferry takes you across to the island. And then once you're there, you're there. So this is the most characteristic shot of Chiloé, the Palafito houses. These first two shots are images that I took myself in past trips, just to give people a sense of where we are. This is just overlooking the point at Quinchao, at one of the lesser islands. And then the next shot is the beginning of the road trip. So we're driving through this landscape, which is just very open. And we're heading west of the city of Ancud, which is the closest to the ferry stop, Quinchao. So it's a short drive from Quinchao to Ancud, and then heading west from there, literally towards the Pacific Ocean, was where Annalise's studio was. Now, I've been to Annalise's studio now 3 times, but the first time was in the city of Ancud. This is her newish place. You have to go up on a hill. It's better with a 4-wheel drive.
So how remote are these places, and have other Chileans been here, or is this one of those places where people know of but they never quite make it to?
Well, it's funny you ask, because there's been a real boom in Chiloé real estate. It's a little off the charts compared to what it was, say, just 5 years ago. And so what longtime residents are noting is that people are buying ever smaller parcels of land and cutting down trees and not necessarily being respectful of the environment. So Annalise lives in a rented space, but she loves where she is. She paints in her domestic space. I mean, it's kind of smallish. She works a lot with the films of Raul Ruiz, the Chilean filmmaker who spent most of his life in Paris, but was from southern Chile and did work related to Chiloé. And she's just interested in having his sort of back catalog become the basis for her own work. Wow.
It's a beautiful interior space too.
Yeah, she's very good about creating the space. So we dropped in. This is the view. You walk out and you see this bay, which the only thing visible is the boat makers, which is down just off to the center to the left. There's actually a boat making an astillero, which is essentially the only traffic on this bay that we were looking at. So, I mean, Chiloé does maintain some of this kind of very rustic isolation, even in this case, 10 miles from a city.
Yep. And here you are in the studio interior.
Yeah.
How hard was it to actually sort of get to know the artists and have them invite you in their space and really sort of have these deeper conversations?
Well, Annalise is one of the artists who studied art. She's in Chiloé because her family has been in the Ancud, Puerto Montt region for generations, and she just prefers Ancud. She just prefers to be in Chiloé, but she functions internationally. I mean, she got back recently from a residency in Denmark, I think, and got back at the beginning of the year. And I think her work is intended to represent being in the place that she's in and the culture she feels connected to, while also being able to circulate through the outer world. So I would put her more in the, I don't know, international class of Chilean artists. I think her use of cinema is really it's an important touchstone, because Chile, how can I say it? Mainstream Chilean culture doesn't really embrace a filmmaker like Ruiz the way France does, for example. He's just not as revered in his own country.
So have you you seen the work of this filmmaker before, and how recognizable are these scenes to other Chileans?
I think they're intentionally, I mean, there's an exception if you come up, I think maybe on the next one. Most of them are from his lesser known film product. No, this isn't the one I was thinking of, but this is a good example. No, so they're not iconic scenes. This scene is somewhat well known in terms of, because I guess the actress is very well known, but it's from a movie called Three Sad Tigers, and the background here is Chiloé. So she's actually, kind of blurring and overlaying these two different realities: the cinematic reality and the place where she lives.
So, okay. So now where's this Ancud? Is this another region, or is this another town?
Ancud?
Yeah.
Ancud is the port town. It's the place, it's the city next to the port. So it's not really a tourist center so much as it is a commercial center where stuff goes in on its way to the rest of the island. And it's just the first day. It's literally set up. So day 2, day 3, I think, is heading out to the countryside, Contui, which is between the cities of Chanchi and Keyon. You just sort of take a right and head into the countryside. And after driving along a dirt road for about 10 miles, you get to Contui. And Contui is a sort of unregistered land, a place where a couple from Santiago who moved there about 8 years ago have set up a sort of artist residence Airbnb next to the trees, next to a river, overlooking a tidal river basin. And it's quite beautiful. I've now stayed there a couple of times. Their idea is sort of more holistic than that, I think. They really want their relationship to the rural community, to the farmers and makers and fishermen and people that raise livestock around them, to become incorporated into what they do as artists. So this particular family I've grown quite close to. This is their main house. It's sort of put together in stages, and which is sort of kind of in keeping with the kind of economic flow, the economy of the island, which is relatively modest. So
what are their main industries? What are their main industries on that island?
They raise a lot of sheep, and they fish a lot. It's a very, very young island, geologically speaking. So there's no really stone to use as a building material. Everything's made of wood, everything, and then sometimes zinc. Sort of panels that are shipped in from the mainland. So you notice this sort of improvisatory quality to a lot of the architecture. And this family, which comes from a very distinguished literary family in Chile, but it was a family that sort of were away during the dictatorship, during the Pinochet years, and then came back to a very changed Chile, and then at a certain point made the decision that maybe it wasn't Chile, maybe it was living in the city that was that was bringing them down. And so they kind of came to the countryside. They just said, we can do this.
Why not?
So the son is a photographer. This is Pablo's sort of darkroom studio area. He works in a lot of traditional processes, including pinhole photography and cyanotype printing. He's doing an extended photo essay on sort of different approaches to sustainable and non-sustainable fishing. Salmon farms is a very controversial subject in Chiloé, and you'll notice later on that one artist kind of goes right into it, almost politically. Pablo is more interested in showcasing the traditional forms of fishing that are sustainable and are increasingly endangered by these more commercial practices. So he's really trying to put his art to use in terms of making a case that his neighbors are making to him.
Right. Let's see.
This is it's actually double exposure photograph that he took. This is me in Pablo's darkroom. I wanted to make sure that you knew that I was actually there, that I wasn't sending a body double on ahead of me. So, it's nice. We hang out. This is the interior of the house. So Camarca Contui, the third actor, there's two of the members of the family. There's their child, Rai, and then there's a Marcela, who is Pablo's wife. And Marcela is an extraordinary cook. So one of the things that holds it all together is mealtime, because Marcela never fails. So they've got this fantastic sort of three-way community that's also important to the broader rural sector that they're in.
This angel.
This is so I had met the mother Clara before, and I knew that she made a living in Baja California in Mexico during Pinochet years, doing technical drawings for scientific magazines, mostly biological specimens. She's a real good zoological illustrator. Well, here she is in the middle of nowhere. And as we'll see in a minute, there's a blue chapel that they have on their grounds. And Clara, the avowed lifelong atheist, and I would say anti-papist, is not too fine a point to put on it, is nonetheless hard at work making these figures of saints that she carves in this incredibly expressive format, very you can actually get a couple of close-ups on it to see how it's detailed. But she's really an extraordinary artist. But again, she comes from a family in which it's expected that everyone makes art. I mean, this was made clear after a couple of evenings together. So to actually label yourself an artist would be considered very pretentious. This is where she works. This is her outdoor studio. It's got a hammock set up. It's pretty small, but it's got everything she needs. As I mentioned, wood is the only material. So she spends a lot of time back there just whacking away at pieces of wood and carving them down.
I'm assuming an outdoor studio, it's a fairly warm place?
It's a very
warm place?
No, we just happen to be there at high season. So it's a place like, imagine Newfoundland or Halifax or Maine. It's a place where people in places that get really hot in the summertime escape to be in a more temperate climate. So I've never been there during high season. It gets pretty crowded. That's Clara herself. So she's just working every day.
Did she explain to you why a woman who's an avowed atheist is making these saint sculptures? I mean, did she explain exactly where that came from?
Well, I think her feeling was that the way she explained it was that how she felt about Catholicism had nothing to do with it. She understood the stories, she understood the meanings behind the stories, and she felt that if she had the technical ability, to render the narrative and the character of the saints in a way that would touch people, then she should do it. It really, being an atheist doesn't really enter into it. It looked at in a certain way. So I thought it was hilarious. I was raised Catholic, and she pulled me over and she said, "Wasn't it horrible? Wasn't it absolutely terrible for you?" I was like, "Sure, Clara, why not?" So here we are. They have geese at Camarca Contui. That's the geese and Clara and myself, just hanging out outside of the studio. It's really very sparse. There's just not a lot of settlement. So this is the chapel. This is the place that I have now committed myself to transforming and restoring and turning into an exhibition space specifically for that rural community. But how we approach it and how programming happens is really the challenge. But
So
the
I
family
also,
has wanted to do this.
I was just going to mention that there's a fundraising campaign for this space, and we'll be posting about that this week. So if those who want to actually be part of it and sort of contribute can do that. So please stay tuned for that.
Thank you, sir. So this, as a 200-year-old space, it was originally sold as firewood, and the family sort of got a hold of it before it was turned into firewood. It sits at the roadway where you go into to enter the Comarca Contui. So the directions getting there always involve, when you see the Blue Chapel, you'll know you're in the right place. So it's already known as the Blue Chapel. And I thought, that'll be the name. We'll just keep it where it is. So this is a road to Rilan on one of the neighboring islands, but it's right facing Castro. It's sort of not an archipelago, but a peninsula off to itself. And we were there to visit Guillermo Gres, whose work with Clara's will probably form the first exhibition at La Capilla Azul. So that's the idea. They're both in their 80s. They're both well known in the community, but because they're in Chiloé, they're also isolated. They're also, sort of far from what's happening in many cases by choice. So Guillermo lives really in the country, as do Clara and Pablo. You can actually go on. You don't. There's no paved road getting there. You have to pull over, and he lets you in, and then you follow this path into the woods, and that's where his sort of two buildings are. He lives there with his longtime partner, Ronaldo. So when we were there, one of the buildings had been converted into a studio to make this very long painting that's part of a commission that the Museum of Modern Art, the MAM Chiloé, had asked Guillermo Gres and also Jose Trevino to do. So these would be displayed at the museum in like 2 or 3 months' time as part of the mid-year programs. And then it will be they'll be permanently located somewhere in the city. So one of the things we got to do was stop in to see Guillermo at the beginning of the trip. And then just as we were leaving, stop by again to see how the progress was going on the painting, because he was sort of under the gun to make it all happen. So he's a self-taught artist. He never studied art. He really kind of fled Santiago around the time of the coup and came to Chiloé just to disappear, basically. And he began making handmade stuff, and the stuff became art, and the art became more complex. And now there are these very interesting, these are the palafitos in the background. These are kind of indigenous trees that are part of the landscape. Ducks are everywhere. Wild ducks are just kind of a signature of life. So he's constantly trying to merge universal icons or symbols from Chiloé culture with a more metaphysical, almost surrealist or fantastic magic realism. I mean, there's definitely a touch of that in his work.
Absolutely. I also see this figure. It looks like with the at the bottom, that kind of reminds me a little of the angel figure that was sort of made, or some of the other sculptures. Is there a certain significance to this kind of wooden leg at all?
No, I'm just seeing that myself. I wonder if actually at some point Guillermo visited Clara at her studio and then made a drawing based on that. Because again, the population of artists on the island is so small, and the off season, the time when it's not filled with tourists, is really 9 months out of the year. So there's a huge stretch of time every year in which folks actually who are there get to interact with each other without dealing with the traffic and tourists.
Wow. And it's amazing, all the detail really opens up as you get closer and closer to some of these works.
Yeah, he's a very mystical person. I mean, he's very interested in evocations of sort of like life beyond, the surface illusion. So the idea of giving all this life to detail while also allowing a middle and distant view, I think is part of his genius. I think it's partly because he never learned the rules. So he's not really breaking rules. He's inventing them as he goes along. These are just typical of the sorts of objects that he makes and keeps around his house, hangs on the wall, and just lives with for extended periods of time. He's very interested in clothing. Here's the view. So he really is, the house is stuck in just the middle of trees. There's no street, there's no neighbors. You can't see anything from the house other than nature. And this is a very conscious choice that he's made, that he has to live this way and everything comes out of that. So now we're in the city, now we're in the capital, Castro, which has 35,000 people, I think. There are a few different art schools, but this is the sort of more indigenous school. It's kind of reaching out to the Mapuche community and sort of other kind of smaller ethnic groups. And we were there because an artist who I'd seen really on my first trip to Chiloé, and we have always been trying to keep in touch with, Rafael Lara, teaches there. And he's been teaching there through the pandemic. And it's a fascinating school. It's got 9 music professors and 1 visual arts professor, and that's Rafael. And he also has the only 2 professional art presses, like lithography presses, on the island. So he ends up being sort of a source of a lot of activity, or he was pre-pandemic. I should say that, Chile's been struck pretty hard in the sense of the shutdown and kind of attempt to keep everyone isolated is, still as strong today as it was, sort of 22 months ago. And I think that's just changed people's behavior for a while. So as I said, he runs a press out of his studio. He teaches, young students, sort of what we'd say junior high to high school students. He also goes to other islands, to sort of more distant corners of the archipelago, and does printing workshops with students that don't have any other exposure to visual arts. It's a recurring problem that I heard the people at Cantui talk about. Rafael talked about it, and later on in our meeting with Andres Avila, he talked about it as well. So it's very much on Chilote artists' mind that they have a mission to make sure that any kid in the boondocks, in the rural areas, gets some exposure to making art from a professional artist who really is invested in getting the best outcome.
So Dan, did they ever tell you, I guess, you went there to sort of explore this work and these artists and the different interconnections and communities. I'm curious, have they ever talked to you about what they'd like from you as a curator? Because, those relationships are two-way, of course. So what is it that you think they're looking for in sort of opening up their studios or their lives to you like this, or their work?
Well, one of the things that's important, I think, is to have somebody paying consistent attention over a period of time. I think that while they were happy to entertain these earlier ideas that I had about sort of doing an international show in Chiloé, I think it's really changed. And now they see me as someone who's making a difference by being there. In fact, Rafael, over lunch, kind of hit that theme really hard with us, because he said, it doesn't matter how, what your next manifestation is going to be. The changes that you're having are already taking place. I should mention that a lot of these artists aren't really part of the very small existing network of artists, of professional artists, who are really more related to architectural practice in the city, and tend to come more from Santiago. You find this tension between locals and second homers to be very prevalent in the art world. And I think one of the things I tried to point out in the article is that we found ourselves, Ramon and I, talking to local people or people from Santiago at a second home on the island, and telling them our tales of these just inspiring visits to these artists who lived right nearby and who they'd never ever heard of. And it's just a strange position to be in. But at the same time, you're thinking, this is why I'm here. I'm here to have this conversation with these folks after visiting artists like Rafael, who Huaychafe is a Mapuche word. It means warrior. And he often creates work in which the depiction of the warrior is a form of resisting sort of Spanish colonial or Chilean authoritarian rule, or I should say Chilean military rule, which is sort of an ongoing conflict in southern Chile between Mapuche people and the Chilean state that's been going on literally for centuries. And that comes up again and again in Lara's work.
And there's a date here, 1888. Am I correct to read that? Is that a special significance?
Yeah. So after Chile became independent from Spain, which was in 1881, I believe, there was a protracted period in which Chiloé said, we don't want anything to do with your new country. We'd rather take sides with the Spanish just to screw you, just to, or we'll be independent ourselves, we'll be our own country. And that created a war. It's a war, I don't remember exactly, but it's got the word Pacific in it. And it was essentially a war between the mainland Chile and Chiloé. And this adversarial relationship, which resulted in a lot of military sort of actions, programs carried out, that lasted until 1888, when Chiloé was finally incorporated into Chile, not entirely by its own will, but at least by sort of the forced annexation imposed by the people who hadn't been sort of eliminated during that protracted period. Absolutely. So 1888 is a bitter date, let's say, in Chiloé history. Raphael's work a lot is about kind of characterizing indigenous lives and practices, relationships to nature, use of natural medicines. It's sort of a running theme throughout his work. And then, of course, the conflict that modern life produces in relationship to that vision.
Yep. There is some more detail from
there's a few more. These are, this is a detail from a lithograph that he did recently about his life. These are wood blocks that he's carved. He's a little short on resources, and he's one of the artists that we're trying to get benefactors in Chile to support by buying new stones for the presses and, kind of just up the supply chain, because that he lives on a public school teacher's salary and, has a daughter. But this is Rafa showing off his work to me. Very sweet guy. This is one of his students. I just want to point out, Paulina Silva was a 14-year-old artist when I saw this print 3 years ago, and I'm happy to announce that of the edition of 3, I own one. And this one was on the wall when I went by the school. So I'm really happy that Paulina is still making her work. But this is what he teaches his students to do. This is Jose Trevino, the other artist who got the commission from Mam Chiloé. This is his handmade house. He's from Chiloé. He went to Santiago to study painting. He studied at Catholic University and didn't finish. He ended up just kind of working, painting restaurants and painting event spaces. And then he just got out, and after a couple of years moved to the top of the hill and built himself this house. Everything that you're looking at, his current girlfriend is an architect, and I think his earlier girlfriend was an architect too. Most of this is recycled from existing architecture, vernacular architecture in the space. And although this used to be his house and studio, now it's just a studio. His house is a couple hundred feet away. But I love this sort of ideal vision of how an artist can live. This is the inside of his studio. Jose spends 10, 12-hour days alone painting up on the hill. and what he's working on right now is this very large commission, for him very large. It's the image of a sheep, and the sheep is positioned relative to sort of the latest results of the logging industry. And Chiloé has a problem with the sort of rapid deforestation of private lands and how that's affecting the sort of water levels and the humidity and the climate in general. And so a lot of what Jose works on is sort of images dealing with these homegrown images to try to make it as clear as possible. When you see the next image, you get a better view of the painting. Right. So this is about 14 feet long. He's an obsessive, almost photorealistic detail freak. I mean, the message is very heavy hitting, but what draws me in the work is the detail spent on the trunks themselves, the sort of interior life. And I think what he's trying to do is animate these areas and say, you know, that the tree has a biography, the tree has a history, it has an individual existence, unrelated to its being piled here with a bunch of other logs. This is somewhat earlier work of Jose's that we saw just before coming to Chiloé in the town of Puerto Varas, which is the closest gallery.
And I think I recognize that door from his house.
Yeah, there's actually a door, and there's a door set in the middle of a field that just sort of like opens up onto the landscape. This idea of doorways set in landscapes is a recurring motif. He's also very close to Guillermo Gress. So this is Silvia Rivera. She lives in Castro, although she's planning to leave as soon as possible. Silvia's in her mid-50s. She always wanted to paint, but she wasn't able to start seriously until she was in her late 20s, around 30 years old. And she's entirely self-taught. She just has looked at art books and studied composition and figured it out along the way. You know, she comes from a more working class labor background. I mean, she did a lot of manual labor growing up. And because of her kind of family and historic relationship to the island, she's very committed to trying to paint Chiloé as it used to be. Her interest is sort of the history of the place and showing something that really isn't there anymore, but is referred to in an almost mythic kind of way. This is Silvia talking about her work. She had dreamed of us coming. She was waiting for us. She knew we were coming when we called. She's kind of like that. And you know, being with her in her studio is very inspiring because she's one of those people who no one locally seems to treat as an artist in a very serious way because she's not versed in academia. She doesn't speak or jargon.
So do you think by you being there and also sort of showing interest, has that, you know, elevated her status that way in terms of like in the community where people are looking at her work more seriously? What do you think?
Well, there is in the sense that, you know, people feel like if she's everything we say she is, then maybe they ought to go out and buy some work. And as it happens, the gallery Bosque Nativo, which is the gallery in Puerto Varas, where the other work by Trevino had been hanging, Ramon and I had a meeting with them afterwards and just said, you know, look, this artist studio is filled with these works. She's put incredible amounts of time and thought and planning into each of them. There's a really fascinating kind of story and structure, and she's selling them for a couple $100 a pop, and it's not right, and people are going to take advantage of it. So this was one of these situations where you actually call in the gallery, you call in the professional gallery and say, please help this artist by protecting them and not letting them, you know, setting up a situation where they can keep a lot of their work for themselves and just let work leave the studio in a steady fashion. And that involves inviting Silvia to be on, you know, panels with other artists, which would be a first for her. So yeah, there are concrete things happening, but this kind of stampede to buy work like this would be a pretty unfortunate thing. And she's done fine, just letting paintings trickle out the way they have. And well, now when she gets out of Castro, which she plans to do pretty quickly, I think that kind of access will be dropped. But just, I mean, yes, people were like licking their chops saying like, what is her phone number? What's her address? You know, like, we'll rent a van and head right over. These are all paintings in progress. Not all, I mean, I had other images of finished works, but I just thought I would include these. A fogon is like a family retreat that isn't a house. It's like something between a tent and a shanty, I guess. And it's the way a lot of the working class, laboring class lived. You always were barefoot. The stove, the pot was in the center of the space. And then a lot of the kind of other activity was pushed out to the exterior. So now people don't live in fogons, but Silvia grew up in one. And so one of the things she's kind of talking about in her work is that there are still a lot of people alive like her that remember this from their childhood, being barefoot and going around barefoot all year long.
You see it here, yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah, she's really taught herself some great things along the way, and this is what she lives for. So this was sort of our break. We went to the Accordion Museum. Chiloé has a really interesting history with accordions. Chonchi was a port, like most of the towns were, but it was the place where you could drop your accordion off to have it repaired. And until the Panama Canal opened, that's how ships went around. You know, they went around Tierra del Fuego, then up the Pacific coast. And in the first major island they came across was Chiloé. So this is a family. Sergio Colivardo Barrio is from a family of accordion repairmen, and he has just taken it to another level. He opened the museum in 2008. It's a storefront with folding tables and, you know, vinyl tablecloths, but he's been able to keep elevating it to a certain level. I know he's dealing in accordions now, but his idea of the museum is that there are no duplicates. So he's sort of an obsessed collector, and he's also a living historian. He's a virtuoso accordion player. I think the next image is of him in front of a captive audience. So this is normal. There's no admission charge. There's no nothing. You just walk in off the street, and if enough people show up, he starts playing. And so the day we were there, it was interesting. Within a half an hour period, we got to have a short but kind of personal conversation with him. And then we turned around and all these people had shown up, and it was showtime. So he gave a little demonstration of different accordions and how they came to Chile, what role they played in the national dance is called the cueca, and it's related to a waltz. And so there was a bunch of stuff going on, but these are all folks from Santiago. These are folks that are in the area spending their summer holidays. And now the Museo del Accordion is legendary. It's just something that everyone has to see when they come to town. And I'm fascinated with this idea, this model for a museum.
Great.
So Andres was the last artist we went to see. He lives all the way in the south in Cajon, but he was in another part of Chile with his family. We met him on the morning of our last day leaving the island. He just showed up with his portfolio and hung out, and we talked for a while. This is an artist book that he made during the pandemic. He also, like Rafael Lara, is a teacher of high school students, and he also spends a lot of his time bringing printmaking, camera obscura, and other kind of easy to share photographic experiments to far-flung parts of Chiloé. So these are some of his lithographs.
Is printmaking common on the island? Is that one of the main artistic forms, you would say?
I think there has been a push to make it so. I would say the main art forms are really more craft-based, and they're carving. Carving wood is most popular. And then the prevalence of wool has created a lot of art and just knitting and other related forms, some of which are really on the borderline between, art and craft. I got really interested in Andres Avala's work through the next slide, which is from a series that he started about 5 years ago called The Song of the Salmon, in which he really dealt with how these salmon fisheries, these commercial salmon, salmoneras as they call them, result in a lot of mutation, result in a lot of messing up with the biology and the DNA of the fish themselves, and that this is inevitably reflected in the product. But his was about these mutated salmon singing to us and telling us what the ordeal that they'd been through. And I didn't have time to download everything, but that's one page of the kind of revised version. And because it's the last day, we got to do a selfie. That's the artist in the center, Andres. That's Ramon Castillo, who took all the photos and was my co-pilot. And there we are. So that was our road trip. That's what I did. That's what I did with the grant that you gave me.
Oh, that's wonderful. I want to sort of read some of the comments, and Carolina Brunet is saying, they're super excited about your project as a Chilean artist living in California. Chiloé is a magic place full of stories and culture, the perfect place to celebrate art. And thank you for this. So she just wanted to say that.
Oh, that's great. Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, and then what can people do to help the artists in Chiloé? Like, what did they need? What did you find? Because I think sometimes as a curator, you end up becoming this sort of intermediary, as you sort of demonstrated during your talk. So what can people do, or what did the artists themselves feel like they were lacking?
Well, not everybody is dissatisfied with their situation. I mean, I think that's an important place to start. Many of the artists feel great, and those artists who do seem to be suffering, setbacks and shortages aren't always of the temperament where they're going to just sort of tell you flat out, like, I need this. You kind of have to do some poking and prodding. I think what people can get involved in is really supporting the structures that are there. But at the same time, the structures that are there don't really support the local artists. So that's kind of why I started the GoFundMe, because I want to get this space in the kind of more rural Chiloé up and running, and just sort of develop a laboratory of how art can be presented and supported in a rural context, in the country, and see how that affects dialogue. We also are starting negotiations on another space, at a larger exhibition space in Dalcaue, which would have investors and the like, so it's way too early to talk about it. But I think what the artists there really need is a structure where they can show their work, be appreciated, and be supported, like artists in a more urban environment are. And they want to be seen. They want to be recognized. I think most of them are happy being away from society at large. Trevino famously will never go to one of his openings for the rest of his life. I mean, he's the most sociable person when you get together with him, but he just can't handle people. And that's just like, okay, that's why you're here. That's one of the reasons you chose this kind of life, as you devote your life to making art.
That's great. So somebody sort of made a comment here, Pagan, thank you so much for your comment. And by the way, if anybody has any more questions, please, this is the opportunity. We have roughly around 10 more minutes, and I want to get in as many questions as possible. So someone's making the suggestion that what you're doing may have been what a lot of curators did years and years ago, and only like the last few decades the models changed. Now, do you think that's true? Do you think what you're doing is going back to an earlier model, or is this a newer kind of way of caretaking and sort of working with artists and bringing their stories to the world?
Well, I think I may have arrived at an older model without really intending to. I think one of the things I really tried to make clear just by laying the story out the way I did is that I came to this place with one idea of what I was going to do and how I could make a positive contribution. And the more involved I got, the more this became about particular people and their lives and their studios and their work. I entered a kind of protracted period of self-critique, I guess is the only way, where I was just like, wait a minute, that's not really what the situation calls for. And I found myself going back just to figure out what the hell it was I was supposed to be doing. And that's I don't know what the model that is. I just am glad I had the time and the opportunity to be able to rethink this, to say, well, in the end, if I know how to get a space up and running, and I can do that, and the space will operate at the service of that local community, which is not to exclude having quote unquote international art in it, not by any means, but it just means a program geared for people who live in that part of the world, that part of Chiloé. Then if we can show that that'll work, if we can demonstrate, this is a viable option, I think that's a good starting point. I think we can build off of that. And if we have the opportunity to sort of open the second space, which would be larger, more commercial gallery space in a much busier town, then I think we can kind of promote this model of sort of larger scale programming that visitors, tourists, and others can really respond to. But that's a little further in the future.
Of course. We have a number of Chileans just making comments saying they love this. Someone saying, how can they support the printmakers in Chiloé? Would you be able to share any information, or what do you suggest? We talked about the fundraiser, which we'll be posting about this week, but are there other ways? I mean, is there somewhere people can go to buy prints or anything like that, perhaps?
Well, neither of the two printmakers that I've shown have a website. Pablo Carvacho, the photographer, does, and you can reach out to him directly. What I've done in my communications with them is, sort of just request PDFs and request, links to specific works. And that seems to work pretty well. I think maybe there's some way that I can, do you have a way where I can publicize or share some of this contact information with people that are interested?
Maybe when we do the post about the Blue Chapel, we can also put some information in that. So if you're open to that, that would be great. And perhaps this is an idea coming from the audience in terms of maybe they can create some sort of portal to sell some of this work in a way that perhaps, would allow people to buy prints and other artworks. And open up a new possibility for them. Maybe the Blue Chapel can have a portal. So ideas.
The Blue Chapel will definitely have a portal.
Right.
I think that's part of the idea.
Absolutely. So somebody else, a New York, an artist based in New York who's also Chilean, is very excited by this report. So they just wanted to say thank you. And then we have a question, an anonymous question saying, do they see an arts festival on the horizon? I guess people know you as somebody who's created festivals and different events. And I guess people are wondering if I mean, I'm sure it's occurred to you, but I don't know, I guess, whether that's exactly what you want to do.
I had this experience about 6 years ago of getting to organize the Biennale of Cuenca in Ecuador, which is the second or third longest South American biennial. And Ecuador is a country with a similar economic stature as Chile. And they're not really in a position to fund these multi-million-dollar projects. And I guess I had the opportunity to see close up how that structure, how that environment makes it work, how you take a budget of, that's barely cracking $250,000 and make it look like it costs 5 times that much or 10 times that much. When you're dealing in a rural environment, and especially in that part of South America, I think that you have to be very respectful of the limitation of resources, or specifically cash. I think that there are ways to bring the Chilean state aboard. I mean, Chile's about to get a new president, and it's going to be, a lot of really interesting rethinking of some of these basic ideas. But even without that, there is money in the Ministry of Culture that will support programming at spaces, but the spaces have to exist first. Right. You can't ask for support to build or renovate or restore or solar panel your space. You could once it was up and running, but first it's on you to get it up and running. So that's kind of why I picked this particular project to start out with the chapel, because the budget is around 12,500. I've asked for a goal of 15,000. I figure we can build that in increments of 10, 20, 50. We've gotten a few very good $500 gifts. So that's going really well. But I want to make sure that this contribution affects this group of people who I know and trust, and whose art I'm really inspired by. It allows them to do something that they can't do without that cash, because like it or not, we're Americans. I mean, we sort of know about getting money. I mean, in the art world, you just sort of know, you just find a way to sort of like, pull things together and call your friends and, hey, let's put on a show, whatever it is.
Speaking of which, so is Chile a country that funds the arts, or are resources incredibly limited? Like, how would you gauge Chile's kind of arts funding in the global scale?
I think it's undeveloped. They have an unusual system, which is called a fund art, and fund art is one pot of money, and institutions and artists, everyone kind of goes after the same pot of money through different programs. And that's it. They don't have tax deductions for charitable contributions or gifts to museums. Corporations don't get a break if they support museums or cultural institutions. So there's a whole lot of just sort of basic stuff that could be done that wouldn't deprive, the Chilean treasury of important revenue, but it would allow citizens to sort of act on their own behalf and say, hey, I love what this small cultural center or this small contemporary art space is doing, and I want to support it with my tax dollars. I want to take that, instead of giving it to the state, I want to give it to this space over here. And in the United States, we're kind of used to being able to operate that way. And I think that's one of the things that could change in Chile, perhaps in just the next couple of years.
Great. So we're at the 8 o'clock, but I want to ask 4 short questions. Hopefully we can get 4 short answers, if that's all right with you. Is that cool?
I'm going to do it.
Let's do it. So someone's asking, I guess, some practical questions. How did you get around the island? And for an idea of the size of the island, how long would it take to get across the island, north, south, east, west? So to kind of get a sense of how big this place is.
I rented a car in Puerto Montt and then crossed in a ferry. They're building a bridge, but the construction broke down a long time ago and nobody knows when they're going to pick it back up again. If you were to drive from Ancud all the way to Cayon, you could do that in a day easily, but you would also have to go, there's one road that connects north and south, and it goes right down the main street of Castro. So in high season, they have horrendous traffic backups. But if you counted that out or said, oh, I'm just going to get 2 or 3 hours, it would take you a day to get from one to the other. Driving from east to west is trickier because the entire Pacific side is undeveloped. It's virgin forest. A lot of it is a national park owned by the soon-to-be ex-president Piñera and other parks. So there's I would say half the island is protected wilderness. And so at a certain point, you're going to run out of roads or there are very few roads and none of them are paved.
So the next question from Naomi Totcher. I apologize if I mangled that. I noticed how many of the works are in black and white and gray, minimal color. Is there a reason for that, or is it a coincidental?
No, it rains 9 months out of the year in Chiloé. It's really famous for being one of the rainiest parts of Chile. And so people are just used to that kind of washed out, grayish, rainy day, cloudy, overcast palette, because that's how their island looks a big chunk of the year. I would attribute it mostly to that.
Okay. Another one. So this person, Jade Dellinger, really loves the presentation. They actually asked a very specific question, which makes me think there might be a connection here. Maybe there is, or maybe not. But they're asking, did you see any impact or exchanges or any artists that worked, I guess, with Robert Rauschenberg's ROCI project, Chile project? Did that project have any kind of legacy in the research you've been doing?
Well, it's funny you should bring that up because one of the incoming artists at Comarca Contui, as we were leaving, they were coming in. One of them is an artist who also does sort of art historical research, and she's working on that particular project. She's been exploring it and writing about it for the last 5 or 6 years. She's been to New York to work with the foundation a couple of times, and I know she's kind of done documented interviews with all the people in Chile that Bob Rauschenberg was interacting with. So yeah, that exists. It's still in pre-published form. I mean, she's kind of wrapping it up, but yes.
And I believe, is the art historian Camila Estrella?
Yes, that's exactly
There.
who it is.
Somebody
Um,
just commented, so I guess people know.
Yes, so Camilla was, I think she might even still be in Cantui in one of those beautiful palafitos over
Fantastic.
the river.
So people are asking, when is high season in Chiloé? You mentioned high season. When is that? Is that it? I'm guessing December, January?
Well, that's what I thought, but I've been in December and it's been kind of fine. And I've never really been in January. This was late January to sort of second week of February. And that's high season. That's when people are most likely to descend on Chiloé. So I'm going to make a point of sort of trying not to be there much after New Year or before like mid-February in the future. I find March is beautiful. October, November are great. But you got to bring your duck boots. You got to be ready for sloshing around.
So I just wanted to thank, it was Pablo Carvacho who had mentioned Camilla's name. So thank you, Pablo, for doing that. Then
Thank
there's
you,
final
Pablo.
question.
Of course, Pablo would know.
Yeah, there's one final question. Someone's asking, I guess people are eager to see the work. Are there any plans to show any of these artists in California or in New York? I guess people want to see the work in person.
Well, there aren't, but I would love to get something going where, you know, an exhibition about Chiloé becomes possible. I mean, I think it's great to think that a kind of a historically marginalized part of Chile can sort of have its own presence in the international world. I think that would be really gratifying and deserved.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Dan. It's very much appreciated. This
Thank
was
you,
a great
Rob.
little journey to learn about an art community that you've been, you know, having a long-term relationship with. And as I mentioned, we'll be writing about the Blue Chapel fundraising this week. So please take a look. Yes, this talk has been recorded. We'll probably be making these into podcasts, or we're going to see, I mean, this one, because it's so visual, might of course be a video. But we will definitely be sharing these. And I just want to thank the Emily Hall Tremaine Foundation for helping support this kind of unusual curatorial project. And thank you for the work, all the work you did, and for taking on the email exhibition. I wonder if you have any thoughts about an email exhibition and how that was maybe different from the other shows you put together.
Well, I tried to think of it as a summing up. I tried to think of it more as like a directory or almost an index to what had happened before, that these are the artists whose names kind of moved in and out of the narrative, and here they are in a sort of a rational order. So I guess, you know, because so much of this process involved getting myself to the studios, you know, getting us there, we didn't try to take on too much beyond that. Like one visit a day was plenty. And so I felt like just presenting the results as results, instead of trying to overshape them and put another structure on them, really was the best way to approach it.
It was wonderful. And I think it captured, with your text, I think you captured the intimacy of looking at an email in a private space, which I think was really wonderful and I think was really effective. So thank you everyone for attending. Next week.
Yes, thanks everybody.
Thank you. Next week will be our final curatorial conversation with Jeremy Dennis, a Shinnecock curator, and who's put together the very first ever contemporary art show of Shinnecock artists, believe it or not, in the year 2022. It's hard to believe, but that's what he has been telling us. So please join us then. And thank you again, Dan, and everyone for attending.
Thank you.